Most people believe that if someone is truly intelligent, they'll rise to the top. They'll become visible, successful, recognized. But what if the opposite is often true? What if some of the most perceptive, deeply aware people you've ever met are the ones who quietly step away? Not because they failed, but because they saw something others didn't. And once you see it, you can't go back. Think about someone you used to know. Someone sharp, not just intelligent, but different. They noticed things early, patterns others missed, problems before they happened. Conversations with them felt heavier, deeper, slightly uncomfortable in a way you couldn't explain. And then one day they just faded out. No big announcement, no dramatic failure. They stopped posting, stopped engaging, stopped showing up the way they used to. You look them up now, nothing recent. It's like they slowly disappeared. And the strange part? No one talks about them like they burned out. No one says they failed. They just exited. So what happened? Where do people like that actually go? And more importantly, what if you're starting to feel the same pull? Because what I'm about to show you isn't just about them. It might explain something about you that you haven't been able to put into words yet. There's a pattern that shows up again and again, but most people never notice it. At first, these individuals seem completely engaged. In school, they're ahead. Early in their careers, they're driven. They ask better questions. They see deeper connections. They're involved, ambitious, present. But then something shifts. Not suddenly, gradually. Their ambition doesn't disappear. It changes direction. Instead of climbing, they start stepping sideways. Instead of expanding outward, they start going inward. They become more selective, more private, more focused on things that don't look impressive from the outside. And here's where it gets interesting. From the outside, it looks like they're losing momentum. But internally, something else is happening. Something most people never experience. And this is where the real story begins. But to understand why this happens, you have to first understand something uncomfortable about how most people live their lives. There's an invisible script running in the background of your life. You didn't choose it. You didn't consciously install it, but it shapes almost everything. What you want, what you fear, what you think success looks like, what you believe is normal. From a very early age, you absorb it. From parents, from school, from culture, from social media. And over time, something subtle happens. You stop questioning it. You start calling it yourself. But here's the problem. For most people, this script works well enough. It keeps life predictable, structured, socially acceptable. But for certain individuals, something starts to feel off. They begin to notice patterns. They realize that many goals people chase aren't actually chosen. They're inherited. That many opinions aren't original, they're repeated. That many fears aren't real, they're conditioned. And once that realization hits, it creates a kind of psychological tension that's very hard to ignore. Because now you're stuck between two worlds. The one everyone else seems comfortable living in, and the one you can now see through. But this awareness comes with a cost, and this is where things start to get complicated. At first, seeing through the script feels empowering. You feel more awake, more aware. But over time, it becomes exhausting. Because now everything requires effort. Every conversation, every decision, every interaction. You notice inconsistencies others don't. You see flaws in ideas people confidently believe in. You recognize problems before they're visible. And suddenly, you're not just participating anymore. You're constantly interpreting, filtering, analyzing. And here's the part no one talks about. You can't always say what you see. Because when you do, people don't always respond with curiosity. They respond with discomfort. Why does that happen? Why do people resist what seems like clarity? We'll come back to that. But first, there's another layer to this. Imagine thinking in layers, but speaking in fragments. Imagine seeing complexity, but having to simplify it constantly just to be understood. Over time, you start editing yourself. You shorten your thoughts. You remove nuance. You avoid going too deep. Not because you can't, but because you've learned it doesn't land well. And this creates a quiet kind of fatigue. Not physical, not obvious, but cognitive. Because you're constantly translating, turning something rich into something digestible, and doing it over and over and over again, until eventually something shifts. You start asking yourself, is this even worth it? And this is the moment where many people begin to withdraw, but not for the reason you might think. From the outside, it looks like they're becoming antisocial, detached, uninterested. But internally, it's not about avoiding people. It's about protecting energy. They're not withdrawing from life. They're withdrawing from friction, from conversations that feel shallow, from environments that require constant self-adjustment, from systems that reward surface-level thinking. And they begin to invest that energy somewhere else, into ideas, into creation, into understanding, into things that don't require them to shrink. And this is where a critical distinction appears. There are two types of withdrawal, one that leads to stagnation and one that leads to transformation. And most people never learn the difference. But there's another reason this pattern happens, and it's far more uncomfortable. Here's something subtle but powerful. Being around someone who thinks deeply can feel threatening, not because they say anything directly, but because of what they reveal indirectly. When someone asks better questions, sees gaps in logic, or challenges assumptions, it creates a kind of mirror. And that mirror doesn't always feel good, because it exposes things we'd rather not examine. So what happens? People don't usually say, "Wow, I should think more carefully." Instead, the mind protects itself. It reframes the situation. They're overthinking. They're too complicated. They're not practical. And just like that, the problem is no longer the discomfort. The problem becomes the person causing it. And this dynamic changes everything, especially in environments like work and relationships. In many systems, especially workplaces, there's an unspoken rule. Clarity beats accuracy. Confidence beats nuance. Simplicity beats depth. Not because those things are better, but because they're easier to manage, easier to communicate, easier to scale. So if you're someone who naturally sees complexity, you're at a disadvantage, not intellectually, but socially, because you're playing a different game. And at some point, many people realize something quietly. This system isn't built for how I think. And then comes a decision: adapt, compromise, or step away. But here's where most people misunderstand what happens next. Stepping away doesn't always look dramatic. It doesn't always involve quitting your job or disappearing completely. Sometimes it's subtle. You speak less. You engage less. You stop trying to explain everything. You become more selective with where your energy goes. And something surprising happens. You start to feel relief. Not loneliness, not loss, relief. Because for the first time in a long time, you're not constantly adjusting yourself to fit. You're not performing. You're not simplifying who you are. And in that space, something begins to rebuild. But this is also where things can go wrong if you're not careful. Not all solitude is healthy. And this is where the narrative often becomes misleading, because it's easy to romanticize isolation, to believe that stepping away automatically leads to insight. But that's not always true. Without intention, withdrawal can turn into avoidance, into overthinking without action, into detachment from reality. The difference comes down to one question. Are you building something in that space? Or are you just escaping? Because only one of those leads somewhere meaningful. And this leads to the most important realization in this entire video. The goal isn't to disappear, it's to realign, to create space where your thinking can operate at its natural depth, without constant interference, without constant reduction, but also without losing connection to reality. Because the strongest position isn't isolation, and it's not conformity either. It's integration, the ability to think deeply, but communicate clearly, see complexity, but express simplicity when needed, move between worlds, without losing yourself in either. And this is where true growth happens, not in total withdrawal, but in conscious balance. And once you understand this, something about your past and your future starts to make a lot more sense. So if you've been feeling that pull, that quiet shift away from noise, that growing preference for depth over distraction, it doesn't necessarily mean something is wrong, but it also doesn't automatically mean you're on the right path. It means you're at a crossroads between disappearing and becoming, because stepping back from the world can either shrink your life or expand it in ways most people never experience. And the difference isn't intelligence. It isn't talent. It isn't even awareness. It's what you choose to do with the space you create. So if you're going to step away, do it with purpose. Build something. Understand something. Create something. Because the people who seem to disappear aren't always gone. Sometimes, they're just finally doing the work that couldn't be done in the noise. And one day, whether the world notices or not, that work speaks for itself. So maybe the real question isn't, why do some people disappear? But what are they becoming while no one is watching?